Between 1095 and 1291, an estimated 1 to 3 million people died in its crusades. Soldiers, civilians, pilgrims, children, on both sides. Over 200 years of almost continuous warfare over a piece of land roughly the size of New Jersey. Your school probably taught you one of two things about the Crusades. Either they were a noble Christian mission to reclaim the Holy Land, or they were a brutal colonial genocide against the Muslim world. Both of those versions are wrong, or at least dangerously incomplete. The real history is messier, stranger, more human, and honestly, way more interesting than either side wants to admit. Today we go all the way in. No agenda, just the facts, and they are wild. To understand the Crusades, you need to understand the world of 1095, because the context is everything. The Byzantine crisis. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern remnant of Rome, based in Constantinople, was collapsing. The Seljuk Turks had just crushed the Byzantine army at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. 24 years later, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I sent a desperate letter to Pope Urban II in Rome. Help us. We are being destroyed. Urban saw an opportunity. The Catholic Church had been trying for decades to stop the constant wars between European Christian kingdoms. Knights with no war to fight were a problem. Violent, expensive, destabilizing. What if he could redirect all that violence outward? The speech that started everything. In November 1095, at the Council of Clermont in France, Pope Urban II gave what might be the most consequential speech in medieval history. He told the assembled crowd that Christians in the Holy Land were being slaughtered, that Jerusalem, the holiest city in Christendom, was under Muslim control, and that God himself was calling on the knights of Europe to take it back. He promised full remission of sins to anyone who went. You fight, you die, you go straight to heaven. No purgatory, no judgment. Clean slate. The crowd's response was immediate and overwhelming. Chronicles record them shouting, Deus vult, God wills it. Urban had aimed his speech at trained knights and nobles. What actually showed up to march was far stranger. The People's Crusade, the disaster. Nobody talks about. Before the official First Crusade even departed, a monk named Peter the Hermit gathered a mass of ordinary people. Peasants, the poor, minor clergy, women, children, and marched them toward Jerusalem. Tens of thousands of people with almost no military training, minimal supplies, and absolute conviction that God would provide. They never made it. The People's Crusade was massacred by the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia in 1096. Most were killed. The survivors were sold into slavery. This happened before the real crusade even began. It was erased from the popular story because it complicated the narrative, but it tells you something crucial about what the Crusades actually were. A mass movement of ordinary people, driven by faith, stumbling into a war they didn't understand. The official First Crusade, led by actual knights and nobles, departed in 1096, around 60,000 to 100,000 people, the largest coordinated military operation in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. The march getting to Jerusalem was itself a nightmare. The march covered over 3,000 kilometers through increasingly hostile territory. Disease, starvation, and heat killed thousands before a single major battle was fought. The Crusaders had almost no knowledge of the geography, the climate, or the political situation they were walking into. The Middle East, in 1096, was not a unified Muslim world united against them. It was a fractured landscape of competing Muslim powers, Byzantine Christians, Eastern Christians, Jews, and local populations who had lived together for generations. The Crusaders walked into this complexity with no maps and absolute certainty that God was on their side. The Siege of Antioch. The siege of Antioch in 1097 to 1098 lasted 8 months. The Crusaders besieged the city, then got besieged themselves by a relieving Muslim army. They were trapped, starving, and on the verge of complete collapse. What saved them? A monk claimed to have found the Holy Lance, the spear that pierced Christ at the crucifixion, buried under a church in Antioch. Whether it was real or not is irrelevant. The effect was immediate. The Crusaders charged out against the Muslim army with absolute fanatical conviction. They won, against odds that should have been impossible. The fall of Jerusalem, 1099. On July 15th, 1099, the Crusaders breached the walls of Jerusalem after a 5-week siege. What followed was a massacre. Contemporary chronicles, written by Crusaders themselves, described the killing of thousands of the city's inhabitants. Muslim and Jewish residents were slaughtered indiscriminately. The Temple Mount ran with blood. This event is documented. It happened, and it permanently shaped how the Islamic world remembered and responded to the Crusades for centuries afterward. The Crusaders had achieved their objective. Jerusalem was theirs. They had no idea what to do next. Here's where the history gets genuinely complicated, and where most simplified versions, from both sides, completely fail you. It wasn't simply Christians versus Muslims. The Crusader states that emerged after 1099, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, existed for nearly 200 years. And during that time, something unexpected happened. The Crusaders and the local Muslim population developed complex relationships, trade, diplomacy, intermarriage in some cases. Crusader lords made alliances with Muslim rulers against other Muslim rulers. Muslim rulers made alliances with Crusaders against other Crusaders. The reality on the ground was far more complicated than the religious war narrative suggests. Saladin, the most complicated man in this story. In 1187, the Kurdish Muslim general Saladin defeated the Crusader army at the Battle of Hattin and retook Jerusalem. What he did next shocked everyone, including his own side. He did not massacre the population. He ransomed the Christian inhabitants. He allowed the Eastern Christian churches to remain open. He personally supervised the safe evacuation of civilians. Contemporary Western Christian chronicles praised his conduct. He was described by European writers as more chivalrous than many Christian lords. Saladin became a hero in the Islamic world and a respected figure in the Christian world simultaneously. A man who defied the simple narrative of religious hatred that both sides wanted to tell. The Fourth Crusade, the crusade that attacked Christians. And then there's the Fourth Crusade, which is either the most embarrassing or the most revealing episode in Crusader history, depending on your perspective. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, was supposed to go to Egypt to attack Muslim power at its source. Instead, it ended up sacking Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Christian Empire, the city that had originally asked for help a century earlier. Crusaders looted one of the greatest Christian cities in the world, stole its relics, destroyed its libraries, and established a Latin Christian empire on its ruins. The Pope excommunicated the entire crusade, twice. It didn't stop them. If you needed proof that the Crusades were not simply a pure religious mission, the Fourth Crusade is your proof. When people think of the Crusades, they think of the Holy Land, but the crusading movement spread far beyond Jerusalem, and some of what happened closer to home was even darker. The Rhineland massacres, before the First Crusade even reached the Holy Land, crusading armies marching through the Rhineland in Germany massacred Jewish communities in cities including Worms, Mainz, and Cologne. Thousands of Jews were killed. Some communities chose mass suicide rather than forced conversion. Medieval chronicles document this in detail. Church leaders attempted to stop the massacres. Local bishops tried to shelter Jewish populations. Some succeeded, many didn't. This aspect of crusading history is rarely taught in schools. But it happened, and it established patterns of persecution that would haunt Europe for centuries. The Children's Crusade, 1212. In 1212, a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes claimed that Christ had appeared to him and commanded a crusade of children, pure in heart in a way adults were not, to peacefully convert the Muslim world. Tens of thousands of children and young people followed him to the Mediterranean coast, convinced the sea would part for them as it had for Moses. It didn't. Most accounts suggest the children who reached the coast were loaded onto ships by merchants who promised to take them to Jerusalem and sold them into slavery in North Africa instead. The Children's Crusade is one of the most haunting episodes in medieval history. A mass movement of young people driven by absolute faith, destroyed by the cynicism of adults who exploited that faith for profit. The Northern Crusades. Meanwhile, in Northern Europe, crusades were launched against the pagan Baltic peoples, Lithuanians, Prussians, Estonians. The Teutonic Knights spent over a century systematically conquering and forcibly converting the Baltic region. This wasn't a war to reclaim a holy city. It was a territorial conquest dressed in religious language. The people who died were not Muslims threatening Jerusalem. They were Europeans who worshipped different gods. By the end of the Northern Crusades, entire cultures had been erased, languages lost, traditions destroyed. The last openly pagan nation in Europe, Lithuania, finally converted in 1387. Under pressure that had lasted almost 200 years, the last Crusader city, Acre, fell to the Mamluk Sultanate in 1291. The crusading states in the Holy Land were finished. 200 years, millions of lives, and Jerusalem was back under Muslim control. So what did the Crusades actually accomplish? What the Crusades changed? The honest answer is more than most people realize, and not in the ways most people think. Trade exploded. Crusaders brought back spices, textiles, mathematical concepts, medical knowledge, and philosophical texts from the Islamic world. The intellectual foundations of the European Renaissance were partly built on knowledge transferred during the crusading period. The Islamic world was transformed too. The Crusades accelerated political consolidation. Leaders like Saladin rose to power partly because the external threat demanded unified response. The trauma lasted centuries. When European powers began colonizing the Middle East in the 19th and 20th centuries, they were called Crusaders by local populations. The word still carries weight today that people in the West rarely understand. The real lesson. Here's what I think the Crusades actually teach us, if we're willing to look honestly. Large groups of people can be motivated by genuine faith to do genuinely terrible things, and genuinely heroic things, sometimes simultaneously. The Crusades were not a simple story of good versus evil. They were a story of human beings, religious, frightened, ambitious, greedy, faithful, brutal, and occasionally extraordinary, colliding across centuries of conflict over land, power, and belief. History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. Mark Twain. The Crusades ended over 700 years ago. Their echoes are still shaping this world we live in today. That's worth understanding correctly. That's the Crusades, not the version your school gave you. The real one. Messy, complicated, and genuinely fascinating. If this series is doing it for you, subscribe. Every week, we go deeper into the history that actually shaped the world. Drop a comment. What surprised you most? The Fourth Crusade attacking Christians? The Children's Crusade? Saladin being more chivalrous than the Crusaders themselves? Next video, the Knights Templar, the most powerful military order in medieval history, how they rose, how they were destroyed, and what really happened to their legendary treasure. See you next week. Stay sharp.